call this meeting to order. This is actually a recorded meeting tonight because we've got a board meeting happening. There's multiple board meetings here tonight. Thank you all for coming and expressing your interest in the boundary work we're doing here in the district. I'm Janet Godwin, Steve Murley, Phil Hemingway, Lori Rowland, Sean Eckstone, and where's Paul Ressler? And Matt and Kim. So Steve's going to kick off tonight just sharing some things that we've been considering since the work session that we had on Tuesday, November 6th. I think you all have handouts that are dated November 6th. We've had some things that we've been considering since then. Steve's going to go over those, and then we'll jump right into some of the comments that we've been receiving from the community since Tuesday.
So there is a new PowerPoint that's up on the internet on Board Docs, which has we're trying to date them all, so it says November 8th on it. There are not a lot of changes from your November 6th one, but I would like to call a couple to your attention. In particular, because I know many of you have written in board members. I had some extensive dialogue with the board team, both before the meeting on Tuesday and since the meeting on Tuesday. And the board discussed many of those changes. And so I'm just going to go through those with you. I'm going to use the map real quick to scan down to those. For some reason it's cutting off the left side. So one of the changes that you would not see on the map that was there for November 6th is that section of the Iowa River Landing. And Lori, you have to remind me, it's the 100-acre wood, but what's it called again? Bridgewater, which is the new development that's going in on the east side of the Coralville Central Advance area. There are no students in there right now, but that area is zoned to Lincoln, recognizing that Coralville Central is close to capacity at 95%, and there's space available at Lincoln. So that new subdivision and some of that growth you see going on at the Iowa River Landing is now zoned to Coralville Central. One of the things that was discussed at the board meeting on Tuesday night was the area that is Penn Meadows and then an area that's assigned to Grant. One of the requests that was made at the time was demographically what it would look like if we went back to what was called option 1, which was part of the original discussion last year when we did the zoning for the new Christine Grant Elementary School. So what you see on that slide are the numbers for Grant as they're approved by the board right now. And then what it would look like if those two neighborhoods were flip-flopped, and the Penn Meadows neighborhood was zoned to Grant, and the neighborhood that's kind of on the south side of the Grant Elementary School area was zoned to Penn. In Horn, the area that you see there in yellow is currently zoned to Borlaug. The area in brown is zoned to Weber. The board had extensive conversation on this on Tuesday night, and Janet's going to talk a little bit more about it, but the proposal that was discussed by the board on Tuesday night was using a grandfathering process that was similar to that is used for the Grant Elementary School attendance area, which would then afford parents that lived in the section that's currently zoned to Weber to stay at Weber or to attend Horn. And I'll leave Janet to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Let's see, I think I'll wait till I get down to Lucas and show you the Lemmy one. There's Lincoln. You can see the Iowa River Landing and Bridgewater. In Lucas, you can see the corner up there that's blue. Currently, that area in this map, this is zoned to Lucas. This was also a conversation that the board had on Tuesday night. I know several of you have written into the board about that, and I'm sure we can have some conversation about that as we move forward. Again, here's Penn and those numbers associated with flip-flopping those two neighborhoods between Penn and Garner. Van Allen, if you look down here on the south end of that, the area that has the red line next to it, which is the Stables neighborhood on the east side there, was zoned to Wickham in the 2015-16 process. And the board requested this model that shows that being rezoned back into Van Allen Elementary School. And then this map of Wickham obviously then shows that area that we just looked at, no longer in Wickham and up in the Van Allen attendance area. I think that's it for changes. All right, so those are the changes from Tuesday night. So I'm going to scroll this back up. If at any point in time anybody needs a map up there, I'd be happy to scroll to that. And Janet, I will turn it over to you.
So by far, the most feedback we've gotten since Tuesday has been related to the Horn and Weber changes. And a lot of feedback from families who 2 years ago had been in Horn, got rezoned to Weber, were concerned with the proposal that now we're saying, let's take you back to Horn, and that's too many transitions in a short period of time. And I think we listened to that feedback. We appreciated very much the concern of the multiple transitions. And so we want to find a way to solve that for you. One of the ways that is under consideration is, Steve mentioned, putting an exception into our voluntary transfer policy, so that if you were in that situation of had been in Horn, got rezoned to Weber, have been going to Weber, don't want to go back to Horn, that voluntary transfer would apply to you as a sort of a grandfathered exception, so that you can continue having your children attend Weber for a period of time until they got, I guess, through the 6th grade. We actually looked at changing the boundaries to, didn't we, Steve, just to experiment with having the Weber family stay at Weber and not get rezoned to Horn. And I think that led to a number of kind of domino effects from a capacity standpoint. And so we're not sure that that solution is going to completely work without changing like 3 other building blocks. So I think the idea that we're wanting to get your feedback on tonight is this concept of sort of grandfathering those families in to stay at Weber through our voluntary transfer process. And so I'm seeing some heads nod. I'm assuming that a number of you here are wanting to talk about that topic, and so I'm open to hear your thoughts and ideas for that particular proposal of having that grandfather into the voluntary transfer policy. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Christine Adman-Horn, and I really appreciate your feedback to my emails. The families, those of us who did have our children move 2 years ago, it was, we played nice, we went along, it was really hard on some of our kids. I shared some anecdotal stories, and so we've been really worked up. As much as we love Horn, our kids are now situated at Weber. We played nice, we moved our children. And to think of moving them back now is really, I think, not a good thing for our kids. And we do have a couple families in the neighborhood who do want to stay at Horn, who have been at Horn. And so what I'm hearing now, which is making me very happy, and I think I'm representing some of the other families on the street who couldn't come, is the grandfathered idea. And so I know my daughter, who I haven't shared this with, I know she's finally acclimated to Weber. She wants to stay at Weber. And so giving us the opportunity to stay at Weber or go to Horn, I think is a good short-term solution. But for long-term, I think even 2 years ago, none of the families on Avenue Lane, we really felt that it was really that well worked out. We felt like it was just this quick decision. And so what I would suggest is that the board really thinks about, if you're going to make a big redistricting, don't come back 2 years later and say, hey, we'd like to move here again, because it's a scary thing, And so I thank you, though, for your responses. I got many responses from you all, and I just appreciate being heard. So thank you.
I think that the feedback was compelling, I think, to many of us, that multiple move, and then also this notion that you went along with the district's move the last time. It was hard, you worked your way through the transition, you helped your students acclimate, and we appreciate that very much, and that you put that kind of energy into that change. And I think we don't want to, pull the rug out and have you with you. So other feedback on, yes, please.
So my daughter is in first grade Weber, and she never attended obviously Horn. But when I told her this thing, that I got an email that you might have to change, she literally cried out. Like, she obviously, for the reasons she has, she don't know about Horn, but she is just scared that she doesn't want to move actually. As like I might think other children also, but yeah, I think it's like if we have option to stay at the Weber, it will be good for us.
Okay, good. Other comments or feedback? Yes, please.
I just sort of doing what you said at the end, is the families who have gotten the open enrollment to be able to come back to Horn are excited about this because they don't have to wait until August to hear whether or not they'll be able to have them again. But again, the families that have been over the Weber would like to stay there. One question is, would that be a grandfather for the students who are
question. I don't know that we've gotten into that level of detail yet.
Yeah,
We'd be interested.
yeah, because we still have one child not in school.
Okay. Then we'll need to take that back and look and see how we can make that, see if that's a possibility. Yep.
Is that a process that has to be applied for each and every year, or is that voluntary transfer something? So you're in that same boat where I'm thinking 8 years from now, I'm still gonna be filling out voluntary transfer paperwork every year unless it sticks.
I mean, that's currently the way the policy is written, that if you are applying for an exception, you have to do that March 1st every year. I think if there's these grandfather situations though, it may be filling the.
They're written
blanks.
in so that that's a guarantee.
Yeah.
The reason that we ask that people fill them out every year is we use that for staffing, so that we know where people are committed to go to.
So the transfer rule apply to the only parent who can find other parent to switch over, or it can be sold like one request also?
It's the general voluntary
no,
transfer,
what
sorry.
you're talking about the grandfather rule. So
For the Weber families who want to
suppose
stay
if
Weber.
we want to have exchange, so do I need to find other family to who want to stay at Horn or who want to exchange, or it's not?
No, if they want to stay at Horn, you'd be in the Horn attendance area, no paperwork.
Okay.
If you're in that attendance area and you want to stay at Weber, then you fill out the form.
I'm Tom Maxwell, and my wife Pete Maxwell, and Mike Brownlee from Melrose Circle. And so I want to let your discussion about Horn and Weber take this course, because we're a Horn family that's impacted by the Lincoln issue. So I don't want to cut off anyone distracted. Either now or
I think I can look at that.
I'd like to say.
I think Steve's ready to look at that.
Okay, thanks.
It's the domino, sort of,
Right.
everything is sort of connected.
I know my wife wrote to the board and articulated our concerns. Our kids are at Horn, and our little neighborhood is kind of an island between Melrose Court and Hawkins. So there's 7 homes in our neighborhood currently, with 2 kids next year that are even going to be elementary students. There's 2 kids that are under 3 months, so it's going to be a while till there's any more. And if part of the purpose for the redistricting was diversification along socioeconomic demographics, the return, I guess, for this disruption into Melrose Circle isn't going to be that much. You're giving 2 kids that are going to go to Lincoln, and I'm pretty confident they won't be free to reduce lunch kids, and so the impact is going to be negligible either way. But the disruption would be big for our kids, because all their, especially my 6th graders, all their friends that have gone through moves to Weber and Warlock and things like that, they've still been part of the Northwest and the West, I guess, frame of mind. And I think the physical barriers and just kind of the boundaries or geographics, I guess, of Iowa City lend itself then to keeping more of that proximity to Northwest and West. And so they're all wonderful schools, and that's a great thing. So that's not the issue. It's really just that next step then, junior high, high school, instead of, planning and thinking that we had done as far as getting to those places, especially west, where it could be a bike ride down Melrose and a car ride or drive, God help me, when the kids get to that point. But it's going to be a whole lot easier than going through town. I get, distance-wise, it's not huge amounts that we're talking about, but just the kind of linear aspect of it is hard. And so that's what I would request is consider that kind of return that you're getting on that disruption of that little chunk, because you're only going to get over the next several years a couple of kids.
I think that's something that we can look at from a numbers perspective to see, you said, what's the change between the two,
And maybe the biggest thing to note on that was the conversation conversation at the board table, and I don't know why this is cutting the screen off on here, but if you look at your, if you look at the slides, one of the things the board, was it 2 meetings ago that we told Forest View out, or 3? 2 or 3? 2 meetings ago, the Forest View neighborhood, which is the little island that you see up here in Lincoln, was moved back to Man. And when that happened, that pushed the numbers at Lincoln down to under 160 students. And so one of the things we struggle with is operational efficiency and having an appropriate number of students to actually build out a grade level cohort. And so one of the things that the board did at that meeting was to talk about how can we expand the footprint of the Lincoln Elementary School attendance area so that we can get north of 200 students. And so that's one thing, again, that we discussed was the development of the Iowa Landing and the Bridgewater neighborhood, recognizing that that should yield students in the future. And then to look at part of that Borlaug attendance area and part of that Horn attendance area to try to create a catchment area that had 200 students in it. So that's the genesis of this map. That's where it came from. I don't know if there's anything else we need to add to that.
I think this is something, we have a work session, we have a board meeting next Tuesday, we'll be discussing this in the work session following that. I think we can see what the impact of that change is.
I just want to comment too that my son is going into 4th next year, and the Brownlee's son is going into 5th. So really only a couple of years left at elementary. Seems sort of like a moot point. What other areas have you looked at to potentially move to Lincoln to increase besides what's on it? Like, were there other things up for discussion?
Besides these areas, I don't recall discussing other areas.
Well, there's a lot of discussion all over the place. I don't think a lot of it gained a lot of traction. I mean, there was discussion of, leaving the entire peninsula at Lincoln, which was the original map, with some of the other changes that we're looking at that probably the most feasible plan. And then there's a couple other places I thought that were brought up in conversation that were created a new map, a visual map that had numbers to go with it.
Well, because I get that you can't take it, you can't take a neighborhood from here and bus it all the way to an elementary school. That's why some of the shifting happens. But like when you look at Horn's map, it's unfortunate that you're bringing kids across Horn and Track to Horn and then taking kids off the other side who are adjusted and go to Horn to not only switch to Lincoln, but like they said to switch to Southeast and City High then also when we've been West Side families.
Oops. And maybe one thing to note there, that was a change that, or one of the changes that the board looked at the last meeting was moving this area that had originally been designated to Horn, to leaving that at, or moving that to Weber, with the idea that rather than moving these students over here and leaving these students at Weber, that they would create the space for the students that are down in that this area of the Weber attendance area. In order to do that, then the students that were here then will move to Weber. So that was part of that.
When I take Horn's numbers and their previous attendance areas, so including the Brown area that now goes to Weber, Horn has the right number of students. It meets the estimated percentages that the district wants, and so it's a school that's at the correct number with the families that go to Weber.
I'm sorry, you're saying moving those families back by undoing the transfer? Sorry. So that's
we started off talking about the Weber families who would move to Weber in the last rezoning and allowing them to have a voluntary transfer process to stay at Weber with boundary
they're good
changes.
without filling out forms each year.
Well, Steve described the need for
The
forms
form
really
is just
for
so that we can do it
staffing.
for staffing, but it's grandfathered in, so that that's in the policy.
It's not an approval process, it's to get the information for student counts to help with staffing decisions.
When would a decision be made though about preceding kids being grandfathered into that too? Because that would make a big difference on our kids.
Yeah, we got a 2-year-old, 3-year-old.
We can't have kids in 2 different schools. It's hard enough to get them to school. So when would that decision be made? That the family would be grandfathered as opposed to just the current students?
Right. that's something that we'll need to discuss at the board meeting next Tuesday and our work session following that board meeting. I don't think we're gonna get into the details of deciding tonight, but the input is very critical for us to be able to take that to our next working
Please
sessions.
consider that, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I live in the Chino area, then should we change it for the next fall semester? But yeah, if you just, yeah, I think that every parent who just, their kids live only 1 or 2 years, then they want to stay in the current school. So if you just recommend to change the school, then, yeah, I think people who left longer, the three more years, they will change their school. And if they didn't want, doesn't want to change the school, then even though they give up their school bus kind of debt, then yeah, we see the long-term view, and everyone satisfied and not changing school district. And in my case, because I'm a graduate student, so I think I'll go back to our country only next year. So because of only one semester, we need to change school, and we need to go back to our country. That my kids need to change it. So, yeah.
And you wrote to us.
Sorry?
You wrote to the board, did you not? With your story, you wrote to us, didn't you?
Yeah, I sent an email, but I didn't get any response yet, so, yeah.
Thank you for coming and sharing that. And so, just general comments, I think, just about our rationale for the changes that we are proposing. And we talked about this a little bit at our last listening post as well, and because we do recognize this is disruptive to families. We do appreciate that, and we get it. And I know that there's some concern that, board members just like to go tinker with boundaries just because that's what board members do. And that's really not the intent. The intent really is to try to make a difference in the balancing and the equitable learning environments that we have in our elementary schools. And I think you all appreciate that. And in all the emails that we've gotten from families, you've all expressed that you get that. And one of the things too, what we've heard loud and clear is, making changes quickly. And, can we please plan longer term so that families have a better planning horizon for the choices that you're making, that kind of thing. And we definitely want to get there. We've talked a lot about that as a board. We have a 4-year facilities master plan. We want to have a long-term plan around buildings and capacity in our district so that we can communicate and have a longer view for you. But the reality is we're opening 2 new elementary schools next year. We're closing 1 elementary school. And as a growing community, we're going to be opening new schools even beyond these 2 that we're opening next fall. So as a community, we're going to have to constantly be shifting. But the goal would be to plan longer term so that we can do a better job of communicating in a timely way so that everyone can make, the thoughtful long-term decisions. Some of the things too the reason why we're pushing to make changes this fall is if we don't make some changes now, we're going to have another year where we've got inequitable learning environments in our elementary schools, and we feel that pressure to try to make improvements because, if we wait another year, we've got issues that are not being addressed for another whole school year, and that's students that are being affected by that. And so we're trying to be thoughtful, we're trying to not be super disruptive, knowing that we already had some boundary changes occurring because of the 2 new opening elementary schools. And we're trying to, in this process, make some adjustments to help us with that longer-term goal around equitable learning environments. And so, that's why we're doing this. And so, along the way, we're trying to do the best that we can to make it as least disruptive and make sense for your students. And so, there's a lot of individual situations, and I think we just need to hear from you on those individual cases so that we can take them into account. As we finalize whether it's the voluntary transfer policy and what exceptions might apply and the length of those exceptions, and maybe some additional tweaks in terms of the boundary, such as your case, some additional tweaks that we're making to make this as best as it can be. So we just need to hear from you, understand your stories, so that we can put that into our process here in the next few weeks. So thank you for sharing. Other comments or questions? I mean, we've been working in a big group, and one of the things we talked about is trying to get some of this general information out, giving everyone a chance to hear what we're considering since our last work session, address some of the bigger topics that have come to us since Tuesday. If it's helpful for us to break into smaller groups, there's a number of board members here, we can sit with smaller tables and get into more specific conversations if that is helpful, or we can continue to do large group. But I'm hearing a head nod I'm seeing a head nod on maybe smaller groups, but there is a question here, and then maybe we'll break into smaller groups here in a moment.
So, I know I sound like a broken record saying this, but I'm looking at the updated numbers on the chart. And so, being a parent in a very, very high FRL school, I feel like this is missing the mark. Like, we made a bunch of changes, but like, the intent was to make equitable learning environments, and we haven't touched that, with 5 schools still being, 4 in 70s and 1 in 60s. So I guess if you could pinpoint, like, what did we see that we gained? And we have lots of families that are upset, and I don't think that those boundary changes necessarily did anything to our 5 highest schools.
So there are some slight improvements from the SES standpoint, but some other improvements that we're seeing through this process is capacity. We're releasing capacity in some of those higher FRL schools, which is something that's also going to help those schools have more room. They'll be able to reclaim their library at Twain, for example, and not have classrooms in the middle of the library. So by making some of these boundary shifts, we're actually helping schools have more capacity, which is actually something we also think is going to help in that school environment. So I don't know.
Maybe one thing to note, again, if you look at the deck that's out there that was posted today based on the changes that the board asked for on Tuesday, I draw, for instance, the example. If you look to the left of these, there are 2 schools that still have over 70% low socioeconomic status. But Kirkwood, on this iteration, has approximately 70% of students. Currently today, it's about 80%, so there's about a 10% reduction there. Hills is the only one that stays consistent from last year to this year, and a big part of that is because to try to keep approximately 200 students at Hills. I had a long conversation with the staff down there. They recognized that we could make the school smaller, which would see an improvement in the number of students who qualify for low socioeconomic status, but then they would lose that operational efficiency. And so that stays consistent from last year to this year. But if you look across here, the numbers, the orange bar is what it would be under the plan that the board's currently discussing. The blue bar up there is where we are today. So if you look on the left side there, and you look across at Kirkwood, Wood, Alexander, Twain, you can see all of those have a fairly substantial reduction in the number of students that are in poverty, that are in those schools. And then the board's been talking about how we work towards getting as many schools as possible closer to that district average. And as you go, again, working from left to right, you see that there are now 6 schools that are in the 40s. And then again, going a little bit further to right, you've got 3 schools in the upper 30s, mid to upper 30s, 4 schools total in the 30s, 2 schools in the 20s. So we wind up in the middle there with more schools clustered towards the middle, which is what the board was trying to do as part of this process. And there are fewer schools that are outliers on the edge. So I just offer that as
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work. I just think that, like, when we were looking at this, there was the very distinct schools that were very, very high. I guess I was hoping for more of a reduction in those numbers. I think it's great that we're evening out, but again, there was some changes to those schools, but I guess I was hoping for more, that they would look a little more equitable between Hills and Wickham, that there would have been a more equitable balance, I guess, is what I was hoping. So, that's my own grief that I have to get over. I was just hoping it would go.
I think we
further.
share that.
So
I share that grief. That I wish we could have done more.
I guess for the next steps, I really want to know, concretely, what are we going to do? What is the next steps? If we're going to talk about magnets, can we get communication out ahead of time so we're not having families that are finding out? I know our school's doing a ton of education right now, and we're already to this point.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, and I agree that what we're doing or proposing this time doesn't get us there. It's making incremental progress, and it's bringing things more into the mean, and we're creating capacity in the higher FRL schools. Those are all good things, but we can't stop here. And so one of the things that we'll start doing after the new year is going back to exploring pairings, school pairings, and magnet schools, and to see, are some of the schools now that we've done some of these boundary shifts, are they now more opportune for a magnet sort of environment, and start playing out what that would look like, starting to play out more what sister schools or pairing schools would look like. And so going through a process for that sort of discussion to see what's the next wave of work that we can do. But to your point, and back to that longer term planning horizon, doing this work early enough, giving ourselves a chance to get our arms around it, understanding the impact, the families impacted, if it's a magnet school, talking to parents and seeing if they want to participate in that and that sort of thing, and giving us enough time to plan it and communicate it in a very transparent and open way. But those are some of the next things that we'll be doing for sure, magnet schools and pairings. And then other things too, we've said this in other work sessions, we talk about it all the time, we're not just moving students, we're working on our climate in the district as well. We're working on recruiting teachers and staff of color so that students can see themselves in the teachers leading their classrooms, and administrators, principals, et cetera. Working on things like implicit bias training, working on things like restorative practices to perhaps shift our approach to discipline in certain areas. So we've got a lot of cultural work to do in the district that's going to support our goals around equitable learning environments. If we just move students and don't focus on climate at all, we're not going to be hitting the mark either. So we've got a lot of those kinds of things happening in parallel with the boundary discussion. In our work session on Tuesday, we had the Equity Committee present to us ideas around how to engage families and parents and the community in what's happening in our schools in terms of communication and engaging and bringing those voices to the table to help us shape our help for students and the work that we're doing. And so that's another set of activities that we'll be focusing on, is how to better engage parents in our school work. So a lot of things happening in parallel with the boundary work. I say it every time, if we just move kids, we're not going to be hitting the mark. So is there a comment back here, or did you?
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying, I'm a parent from Kirkwood, so I really appreciate that last comment. I just found out about this last night. So my son will be going to junior high at North Central, North Liberty, and there's Northwest right in front of me. So that's upsetting to me that my child cannot go to junior high in his community. But also the fact that, I'm just going to name it, for me, it's like, we're moving Black students, right? Like, we can use coded language, but we're moving Black students to other environments under this veil of increasing socioeconomic diversity. But what happens when the students get into these new environments, right? So that cultural piece is really important because, shifting to another school is not going to affect their family socioeconomic status, right? They're still going to be free to reduce lunch in these other schools. So how are teachers and staff being prepared to genuinely and intentionally support those students? That is also my question. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think if we're seeing that there's not a lot of change happening when you're just shifting students around, when I first saw this, I was like, oh, I feel like we're in 1954 again, right? We're just busing students around and not addressing the real issues of lack of affordable housing in our city and corridors, right? So that's the larger issue.
Yeah.
When we kind of placed it on, the free reduced lunch. My son started out at Warlaw, it was not a good experience for him, right? Came to Kirkwood, it's been night and day. So I'm thankful for the faculty and staff there that have been so supportive of him. So like this misnomer of these, low-income schools being horrible, it's been night and day, right? And I'm a graduate student in education, so I'm well-versed in, what this looks like. But just the labeling is problematic for me, and what that means specifically for families of color and expectations for how we're engaged in this process. So thank you for naming that, but I hope that this conversation continues.
Yeah, no, that's good. I don't know, do you want to comment on teacher, preparing teachers and like some of the things that we've been doing, for example, at Lincoln, anticipating some of the changes that were happening this year. I know there's been a lot of work that school's been doing with teachers, right, to learn, grow, be ready for changes.
Okay.
Real quick before you jump in, just to touch on one of the points you made, the first point you made about Northwest and North Central. As a Kirkwood family, you do have the option to go to Northwest or North Central, so you can go to Northwest. Your high school option though is Liberty.
See, that's great to know, because last night I was given a form that said my child, I had to fill out a voluntary transfer. So I was not told that, and I think maybe other families should know, and we're not automatically being told it also.
Yeah, that was the decision that was made in 2016.
We're having that confusion at Alexander too.
Yeah, you have to fill out the form, but it's just like we were discussing with these other folks here, for the staffing purposes, but it's in there that you'll be granted to go to Northwest. The same way with Alexander, kids can go to Southeast or Northwest.
No, I appreciate that, because I was not told that last night, so thank you.
Yeah, but then your high school option would be Liberty.
And there's no way around it.
Not right now, not yet.
Yeah, you can transfer out of Liberty to
West
West
right now.
Yeah.
You could apply for a transfer for high school, but it's guaranteed. Like if you fill out the paperwork, it's guaranteed for the junior high, you just
Right.
you have to be approved for the high school, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And at least until we grow a lot more, the high schools are open, so. So I'll just offer this real quickly as a follow-up to it. We've known since 2015-16, for instance, that there's going to be a major shift in the populations at Lincoln and Man. So we've spent a lot of time with those faculties working on what's next for them. I think if you talk to the administrative team and the teachers at Lincoln, they're really excited about the change that they see coming for the community, and they've been very intentional about preparing for it. It goes back to exactly the comments that you were making about what is our role in terms of working with staff and the community from a culturally responsive standpoint to make sure that they're as best prepared as possible. And that is something that we're doing at Lincoln, but we're also doing it across the district. If you look at where Iowa City was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, today, the numbers are changing radically. We're literally up 400% in the number of students who have English as a second language. That has made an enormous change in what we do in the classroom, more so at the elementary level than the secondary level, just because from a pyramid standpoint, we have more ELL students at the elementary level than we do at the secondary level, but we know that's moving through the system, and that's going to transpire at the junior high and the high school level, so we've been very intentional about that. The number of students that qualify for free reduced lunch has doubled. But that's doubled at the same time that the district is growing. So the actual number of students, the percentage is doubled, but the number of students has tripled in the district if you go back 20 years. And so that is also causing us to spend a lot of time looking at how we teach, what we teach. You made mention of Kirkwood, so I'll just step out for a minute and say that one of the things that started at Kirkwood, which is now migrating throughout the rest of the district, is a program called Kirkwood, which is very intentional about teaching cognitive learning skills to students. But more importantly, it's about teaching teachers how to work as facilitators in the classroom. And to stand beside the students as opposed to standing in front of them and making sure that they're directing their own learning. And that's really, I think I heard it in what you said, it's really changed the educational environment at Kirkwood. We migrated that out to Alexander, we moved it up to Northwest. We wanted to see if that was just a one-off at Kirkwood or if that was actually something that was changing the way that teachers were teaching and students were learning. We started to see that at other schools. We're now looking to expand that across the elementary level and move it up into the junior high and then into the high school. And you know, it's everything from organizational skills to that metacognition, how do kids think about what they're learning. And we're seeing the change in the assessment scores that the kids have as they move through the system. And that's something we can't continue to do what we did 10 to 20 years ago because our students don't look like they did 10 to 20 years ago. So what are we doing to make sure that we are meeting their needs where they're at?
One of the comments too you mentioned around affordable housing being an issue, and our elementary schools reflect, right, the development that they're around them. And so one of the things, it's sort of a longer term play, right, but working with the municipalities, we meet with them on a quarterly basis. This is always a topic of conversation. What are the cities doing to ensure that they're building, zoning and building developments that are multi-level, I'm not using the right words, but mixed housing, mixed use. I'm sorry.
Inclusionary zoning.
Thank you. I needed the right term and I wasn't grabbing it. Thank you for that. But so we're working with the cities on those sorts of things and advocating very strongly that our elementary schools are a reflection of your decisions around zoning. And so we need to work together in our community to make these kinds of decisions together for that greater good, right? And so, as you raised a really good point about that.
Maybe I'll offer a couple things, by the way. I'll just let you know that Director Ressler is leaving because there's a PTO meeting in Hoover tonight, and they've asked for some kind of board presence, so he volunteered to head over for that. And in line with the issues that we've looked at from an instructional standpoint, we also know the impact, and the board's been working on this 4 years, Ram? 4 years? 4 years. Been working on class sizes in our high-need schools for the past 4 years, and we've used a reduction model in the class sizes at our highest need schools, and that's really caused some problems for us because Alexander would be a good example. People look at it and say to the board, what were you thinking? You build a school, I drive by, I see modular units out there. How come your planning wasn't such that you didn't need modulars a year after it opened? Well, when we planned for and designed and built Alexander, the presumption was we put 25 students in every classroom. Now with the weighted resource allocation model, we recognize that we need smaller classes for the students to meet their needs. Well, if you take that same number of students and instead of divide by 25, you're dividing by 20 or you're dividing by 16, you need more classrooms. So one of the things that the board asked us to do from an administrative standpoint was to make sure that we right-size the population for the school. Kirkwood would be a great example. We've got a whole bunch of modulars that are parked on the east side of the Kirkwood campus right now so that we can have those small class sizes. So if you actually want to have small class sizes in a building like Kirkwood and not have a bunch of modulars parked outside, the population of the students in the school has to be significantly smaller. But then the challenge was, where could we send some students from that school where there might be open seats? None of the schools that were neighboring had open seats. And so then the challenge was, and this was the iterative process the board's been working on since last November, if you send some students from Kirkwood to Borlaug, which is next door, now there's too many kids at Borlaug. Okay, where can we send kids from Borlaug? Well, if we send kids from Borlaug to Horn, okay, now there's too many kids at Horn. And so one of the things that the board did was to try to look at it and say, if we move some of these pieces around, can we create some right-sized schools? And whether it's right or wrong, where we started was, can we right-size our highest need schools first? So can we make sure that Kirkwood has the right number of students in the attendance area? Can we make sure that Wood has the right number of students in the attendance area? Twain has the right number of students in the attendance area. Alexander has the right number of students in the attendance area. And then after we did that, then the dominoes started to fall. And that's one thing that the board's been working through now for months is, how do those dominoes fall and where do they go? So I don't know if that helps in terms of thinking about how they got to where they're at today, but being on the receiving end of, can we move this group here and that group there and doing new versions of the maps, that's the thought process that they've gone through. I think it's very deliberate. I think it's very intentional. I think it's hard sometimes to see from the outside because you kind of dip in and dip out and you don't see this, but we've been literally meeting every week, often 2 times a week in some cases, over the past few months to try to figure out how those dominoes fall. I don't think there's a right answer to it, but I would say from sitting and listening to them deliberate, and then trying to take their conversation and put it into some kind of model that works, they have been very intentional about it, and I think that the focus is on what we need to be focused on.
I kind of just want to make a comment in general, and I appreciate everybody's been receptive and listened, and I do feel like we've heard what we had to say and responded to it in a way that I think will help us be at peace. That's all very analytical, all the data that's up there, but I mean, I would say as a parent of kids who are at Horn and that was overcrowded, the move to Weber was more disruptive to them than being in an overcrowded school. And so the fact that in 2 years, they may be going through the process again and again and again might meet these metrics, but I don't know that being in a school that's at a perfect metric is more beneficial than staying put. So.
And maybe I'd offer one thing too that the board talked about 3 or 4 meetings ago was in response to that general idea that we know that there are times we have to change elementary attendance areas because we open schools. If you open a school, we have to populate it with somebody. people know that, they recognize it, they may not be happy that things have to move, but everyone knows if there's a new school, it has to have new students, and that's gonna require a new attendance area. And so one of the things the board talked about a few meetings ago was this idea of, can we put some type of master plan in place that says attendance areas will change when buildings open? And that we can then have, whether people like it or not, there's a logical rationale for it, and it doesn't appear to just be random.
And it's a longer-term view. That's really what we want to be able to get to, is that longer-term view. Yes.
But like, how realistic, watch me raise my hand without thinking about what I'm gonna say. How realistic is having a longer term plan? Because I as a parent would appreciate that, because then I can say, okay, this is what's gonna happen, everyone knows clarity, it's nice to know. But as Iowa City grows and changes, as people have more babies, and as, we build more things, and people can live in them, like, how do you, also thanks for serving on the school board, because how I do it. So, but how do you even do that? Or is it realistic, can we even expect that, we want to come to these meetings all the time?
Go ahead, yeah, please, Sean.
Very quiet, just trying to listen, but I know a long-term plan is difficult, as you just said, but we do get biannual, pretty good reports where they're looking at upcoming developments and where they think people are going to start moving. One of the things that has made a long-term plan difficult up to this point in time is the fact that we had voluntary transfer across the board, right? So we made a very unpopular decision to restrict that recently. Because it's hard to plan 6 years from now if you don't know the kids that live in that area are going to be in that area or at 20 different schools, right? So that was a long-term decision that we made that has very real short-term consequences, right? And part of those consequences are we overpopulated schools now because they had significant numbers of kids not in their home school, which has then caused this whole iteration that we need to start moving other groups around. And so long-term plans cause short-term headaches, right? And you're all feeling very much the short-term headaches of what we're trying to make into a long-term sustainable plan. And every little piece that we try and put together to make it a long-term sustainable plan is going to affect some of you in a very real way. And that's what makes it very difficult from our end to want to keep doing it. That's not a joke, because I sit here and I listen to every one of your very real stories and how it very really impacts you personally, and it makes me not want to do anything, right? And if I take myself away from that and say, you know what, I'm doing it for the right reasons, I'm doing it for the long term, that makes me the asshole, okay? And this is why this is a very difficult process, but this is why we want you all here to tell us when we are misstepping, but misstepping in a big term, long-term way, not misstepping this little neighborhood, I really wish it was going somewhere else. Because that's not helping anybody as a whole, right? I think you've all made really good points. I think the Weber-Horn thing, that came to a head, right? And I think there was a very real reason for that, and I think it was a very real misstep, because we didn't have all the information at the time we started looking from one map to the other map, and it's where I want to put out there and make sure everybody's aware of it. It's not, the way we have put the maps out, it seems like, here's the new thing, this is what's going to happen, right? And then something changes, and this becomes the sole thing you look at because it's the new one. All of these maps that have kind of appeared over time, over the last however many months now, I think all of those things are still options on the table. I think that next week is where we have to really do our work and have it come together to have something more concise and really drawn out and say, here's one plan, or here's two plans, or maybe 3 plans that we're going to put together to try and vote on and really narrow down the focus. Because as we sit here and go through this process and we move this one here, well, that looks good. Well, what if we move this one? That looks good too. A lot of it looks good. And to this lady's question about, why don't the numbers look better in the end? That wasn't the intent at the start of this whole process, okay? probably half of you maybe read the paper that the school board's gonna start pairing schools, and that's gonna happen like yesterday, right? That was definitely part of the conversation at one point. We were trying to address very real disparities across schools, knowing that that's a long-term plan. We also knew that there were boundaries changing next fall, so it's, okay, can we do anything with those boundaries to make things look a little better? Not great, but better. And so we've really gone through this whole process, and if you're really bored some night or you can't sleep, I recommend going and listening to all of our work sessions. It's a good time. There's a very long train of thought that went through this whole process. And to the end of it, I think was the whole point of many meetings ago, the end goal was to have what is the long-term sustainable plan. Let's back up from what pie in the sky looks like out here and back up to where we are today. And what can we do today to start that step on the path? So, again, I sound like I'm kind of angry or something. I'm not. I really appreciate everybody coming out and giving us the feedback so we have something to work with. And I want every one of you to walk out of here happy as a clam that the boundary that where your child is, it's exactly what you want. I can't guarantee that. But some of you will probably not be happy by the time this process is done. But the kids 20 years from now, I'm hoping that they're happy.
Having been through this 2 years ago with our kids, I would just like to say that we feel heard. If our kids end up transferring back, we see that you have heard us, and we have got, I mean, the board is an institution, but it's populated by individuals, and you as individuals have made us feel heard and respected, and we are very thankful for that. I think that was part of the overwhelming we had coming out of 2 years ago, is feeling like we got a response that made us feel kind of shut down. Like our kids didn't matter. And I think we do see that as much, and you're in a tough position because every single one of us will come at you with our hearts first.
Of course.
So thank you for making us feel heard, even if we don't get what we want, but make it well right.
I love the question, thank you for those comments. And I love the question about how can we actually do a long-term plan. One big thing that we have now that we didn't have 2 years ago was a bond that gave us the spending to actually build capacity in new schools in the district as our populations continue to grow. So that's something that we can build upon to do longer-term planning. I mean, we know, for example, it's not part of this bond, but we know we're going to have to open a new elementary at some point in the North Florida area. We know that. And so long-term planning, we can start thinking about where that is and how it might start coming to be part of that plan. The longer-term plans around magnet schools, we're not going to start those next year. It might be 5 years. I don't know. We haven't figured it out yet. But, figuring out what, is that something the community is interested in? And if so, what are the programming that you'd like to see in magnet schools? And where could we locate that school? And how do we make the logistics work? That's something that we can do and put into a long-term plan and engage community members and parents around, is that going to work for you or not? And so I think I'm actually kind of optimistic. I appreciate all your comments, Sean, about doing things today that are short-term and feel hard, but as we're building a base and creating this incremental movement and seeing the gains, that's something else that we really need to be focused on. Again, we don't want to just move students to make the charts look good. If that's what we're doing this for, that's the wrong reason. All of the points that you've made about these are your students that are being impacted, they're upset, you're upset about this stuff. If all we're trying to do is make the numbers look good, then we're missing the mark. We need to have good ways of measuring that these changes are in fact having the outcomes that we want, whether it's climate survey improvements, right? That we see that our students are feeling better and our teachers are feeling better in the classroom. Improvement in academic achievement, improvement in social emotional learning skills, improvement in critical thinking, whatever it may be, whatever we believe are the right measures, we're going to be working on that. But then making sure that what we do has the intended outcomes that we're seeking, and so being very deliberate about that. And to get to those kinds of outcomes takes time, and it takes long-term planning, and it takes sessions like this to get feedback and input to help us make sure we're focusing on the right things, and as Sean said, not taking the steps along the way.
Maybe I just add one other point about long-term planning, and while it's difficult to do, I think you could have seen it in action. And I know some of the folks here were present. I can see a couple faces that were here last spring. So when we knew that the school that was supposed to be in Scanlon Farms was going to move up and wind up actually being north of Penn Elementary School, we went through a whole series of meetings up there. And one of the conversations that took place between community and board members was thinking ahead. And so the final attendance areas that they landed on were a recognition that the Garner Elementary School attendance area is relatively landlocked and there's a little room for growth. So that attendance zone was right-sized for the school. A recognition that there wasn't going to be, at least in the immediate future, a lot of growth in the Grant Elementary School attendance area. And so that school was right-sized for that building. And so if you look at the plan as it stands right now, Penn has space. But that was very deliberate, because if you go up outside of Liberty High School and you see all of the housing that's being built up there, homes and townhouses and apartments, at that time they knew that was coming. And so they said, let's right-size these two and leave a little space here, knowing that that's going to grow out, and then we won't have to make a change. And when that gets so grown out, we have a parcel of land inside that attendance area where an elementary school can be built and split that attendance zone. So in the best possible scenario, there might not have to be in the foreseeable future any change to the Grant or the Garner attendance areas. Penn would be the one that would have to change, but that would be because of the growth that occurs in that neighborhood. And that was, again, we had a lot of community members that came in, multiple evenings at Liberty High School, and that was the dialogue that took place as we sat at those tables. So that, hopefully that, one of the things I'd like to convey with that is that you do make an enormous difference, whether you're writing to the board, writing to me. Those are things that we listen to. It helps us hopefully make better decisions for children and your children in particular.
Other questions, comments? Yeah. So if we want to break into smaller groups, happy to do that. For the last, it's about 7 o'clock now, and so there's what, 4 of us, and so what we can just kind of spread out in the room in 5 county seats, and so we're happy to have individual conversations. So I just want to make sure that no other kind of comments for the larger group want to come out, or any questions want to come out. Sure. The voluntary transfer guidelines, do you have that, or?
Yeah, up there. So essentially the way it's set up right now, that anytime you have a 5th grade student who's moving into 6th grade, who would have to change schools for any reason at all, those students are provided a capstone opportunity to stay at their elementary school so they can finish 6th grade there. So that applies to any student anytime. There's also an exception for students, what we call good cause exceptions, and that's under the state open enrollment law. So if you have a student that's transferred for a health reason, or they had to deal with bullying and harassment or anything like that, there's an exception for that. There's also an exception for students who were under the old permanent transfer guidelines, so they had been transferred in before the 2014-15 school year. And also an exception for students who transferred in through the sign-up process, who would have had that exception granted to them in the 2015-16 school year or prior to that. And then we do have that exception out there right now for that part of the Lincoln Elementary attendance area. We have students from 3 different enrollment zones that were originally zoned to go to that Scanlon Farms Elementary School, and then when that changed, they moved. And so those would be students that were in Wickham, and then zoned to Penn, Lincoln, then zoned to Penn, Van Allen, and zoned to Wickham. And so those students were also granted that opportunity to make that transition through the voluntary transfer process. Although the Van Allen one may be moved at this point. Oh, I'm sorry, and the equity transfers too. In Appendix A, and that essentially says we figure out where the median is for the district for our socioeconomic status, and then if you are moving from a higher poverty school to a lower poverty school on either side of that average line, then there's that opportunity to make that move. And again, the idea there is to help equalize our schools.
Can I ask a question about that? So I saw the form, the current form,
says that for the equity transfer, this decision wouldn't be made until August. Isn't that a little bit too late for the kids to, or also for parents to plan?
So part of it for us, again, we want to make sure that there's room for the students who live in the neighborhood. And we have a lot of students who, from a registration process, we are still registering resident students well through the summer. And so part of our challenge is making sure we've got enough seats for the students who live in the neighborhood. And so we'd like to do it before August. I don't know if we will, I can't promise that we will be able to, because part of it is that registration for the students that live in the neighborhood. So we want to first guarantee the students for the seats for the neighborhood students, and then create room for students who are coming from outside the neighborhood.
Would we be able to say, we received your application, you have met the requirements,
Yes.
you know, you've been deemed that, you know, it's acceptable under the plan. If there's space, then you'll get that information later, but at least have that initial call. Like,
Certainly do that.
So realistically, like how many days before the start of the school would you hear at the latest?
Yeah, it could be 3 weeks. Which you're right, is very tight window.
Sure. Yeah, so Lori is very aptly saying we need to talk about the remaining deadlines or the dates that we're moving forward. So I mentioned already that next Tuesday we have a board meeting where we'll be discussing the boundaries and proposed boundaries and having a discussion at the board table. Following the board meeting, there'll be a work session where we continue the conversation. Maybe community comment, we have more emails and calls from parents. We'll take that into consideration in the work session. Our goal in that work session next Tuesday is going to be to try to get to a set of proposals that we feel comfortable with, that addresses the comments and questions that have come in. So then on the 27th of November, in a board meeting, we would be proposing to vote on the boundary changes in the 27th meeting. We're proposing to also have a work session following that board meeting. If we vote to make some boundary changes, we'll start in that work session talking about implementation. I know that Assistant Superintendent Amy Portemeyer has been doing a ton of work preparing for if we do vote and approve boundary changes, what are the communication plans? How are we going to start engaging with before and after school programs? What does transportation look like? I mean, there's a whole bunch of operational logistics details and communications that need to occur with families. And she's got, I think you said, a 50-page plan or something that's outlining all these steps. And so that's actually one of the reasons why we're pushing to have this vote on the 27th of November, is so that we can very quickly start moving into the implementation phase of this work, knowing that we have a very short amount of time to make this happen for the 1920 school year. And then we've got another board meeting in December where, you know, depending on the action on the 27th and outcomes from any implementation plan, we'll continue these conversations at our board meetings as necessary, and providing updates that way as well. So just an overview of the next steps in upcoming board meetings.
So just to clarify for the folks over here, so is the idea that they will be able to be grandfathered in to stay at Weber, is that a done deal, or do you guys need to vote on that?
No, we need to discuss that, and that would be a modification to the voluntary transfer policy, and so that's something that we need to take on as a potential agenda item for next Tuesday, so that we can, either in work session, it may be in a work session topic, but it's not a done deal.
Okay.
We need to have that conversation, we need to get some proposed language for that, we need to consider these other comments that have come up around the scope of that, and then we need to codify it in the actual policy itself.
one of the things that Director Rowland rightly brought up at our last meeting, I think it was just the last one, was that having a statement on the voluntary transfer policy that says this will be reviewed as boundaries are reviewed, because they have to go hand in hand. I don't know that we intended to have it go into effect immediately right away as we're talking about boundaries, but that was definitely a part of the conversation, that as you talk about boundaries, you need to look at that voluntary transfer plan and make sure that both pieces still make sense together. So it would require a vote to do it. It is obviously not a done deal. We haven't voted and we haven't discussed it as a group. So
But it's not a done, but we listened and we need to make this change, and so we're gonna be working on what that language looks like and getting it into the policy. I don't want you to leave feeling it's squishy. I mean, this is something that, we intend to do. We just need to go through the formal process of getting it, described in language and into the policy itself. Yes?
So speaking of voluntary transfers, the form when you turn it in says that the voluntary transfer form becomes invalid when school district boundaries change. Is that any time there's a change? Is that 11/27 meeting when you vote on this going to automatically invalidate all of the transfers you've already received? Then everyone has to resubmit them. So I have a sixth grader who I submitted a voluntary transfer form from the Alexander district. Do I need to resubmit that? Even though we're still going to be at Alexander, is that going to?
It won't affect this year, it won't affect this school year, so the next wave of requests to be submitted would be March 1st for the 1920 school year. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think so.
Yeah, so no, wherever you're going this year for the 19 school year, you're set. Right? I'm playing it right, yeah. And so these boundaries that we're talking about are for 1920, and the modification to the voluntary transfer process that we've approved and we will amend in our next board meeting will go into effect for the 1920 school year.
So you put in a request for 1920, you're wondering if these boundary changes will make the 1920 voluntary transfer form invalid?
But we wouldn't have it at 1920 yet, would we?
We wouldn't have approved those yet. So if you turn one in for 1920, those are due March 1st.
Okay.
So then,
Have you reviewed them yet, so they're not affected by this, or?
we haven't reviewed any for 1920 yet.
Okay.
You wouldn't have to turn in the form again, I think is
That's
the short
fine.
answer.
Thank you.
Oh, no, you wouldn't have to turn the form in again. If the form's on file, you're all set.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry it took us a minute to understand the question. Sorry about that.
I think that one of the confusing things about that statement is that one of the things that actually pertains most to is when a school opens. So when we have a brand new school, voluntary transfer is not something we generally offer, because if we would, then nobody would go to the new school because change is hard. And generally people don't want their kids to make a change. So that's a little misleading, unclear as to what that statement's really getting at in that policy, but it's really there more for the purpose when there's a new school opening, and not saying that there are no voluntary transfers allowed when a new school opens, because there are certain things that are required by state law that we will honor, but generally speaking, when a new school opens, everybody needs to go there the first year if you live in the zone. And so, for example, Hoover next year is opening, and Grant is opening in North Liberty. Those are new schools. So if you live in that zone, generally speaking, unless you fit one of the requirements, those folks will need to go to that school. And that's been district, it's not really policy, but it's been district practice for as long as I've known the district to open schools. It's
As long as I've been here.
as long as, yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask a
Yes,
question?
please.
It's about the timeline.
Sure.
So, should we assume then that the maps that come after, or the iteration of the maps that come after the 11-13 work session are the final maps that are going to be voted on? Or will there be another community input session after we get a chance to look at those?
We're not planning another community input session. When you look at the calendar, Thanksgiving's in there, and there's that school to out and stuff like that. So I think if we feel like from your input that we need to have another one, we will try to make that happen.
Okay.
And so I do encourage you all to look at what gets posted for the 13th meeting. And maybe I think there's maybe some tweaks, but you're the master.
There's a few things on here that I think may not wind up on the 13th based on feedback and conversation, so I would take a look at the 13th. And I'll have a little bit more time between now and the 13th, so they won't go up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon like they did today.
So I encourage you to look at them. I encourage you to come to the board meeting on the 13th. Community comment, if you want to ask questions and make comments at that forum as well. And then email us. And so we'll gauge whether we need to have another listing post based on the feedback from the community. Really, really good questions. So we've got about 20 minutes, and I'm happy to break into smaller groups and we can finish up our meeting that way. Does that sound okay? So we'll just take corners.
There were just so many things.
up a little bit. Now, if you look at the wrong fellow, if you look at Borlaug. So Borlaug's right here at 36, the others at 38. So,
Why the Borlaug is keeping it? It's the lowest one.
so they actually knew Borlaug. So now that they've done with Borlaug, they've taken the Boston Blue, which was the current rate, and that's all they know. Department's out there, and they're actually moving it. So moving it up, that's all the way. So moving that large, I probably would have been Borlaug, then we had to move some students back in. So what we did is we moved the students over to the edge of the world. So the kids out here, and the kids downtown. Yep. So that's the so just kind of like tipping over the ground.
So why we cannot split
There isn't enough.
Borlaug like
There wasn't enough room to move them. So there isn't enough room to move them to Weber because it keeps them about the same. No, it's not. It does. But again, we're trying to make them easy. It is. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just wonder if that possible, possibly the sun
No, it's not an easy thing to do at all. So, eventually at some point, we're going to have
maybe after Karen go to high school.
hopefully not that long.
Yeah, that would be perfect. By that way, Weber now capacity only like 84. If they go there, Weber is still not full, and all of them will have some space. It definitely can have some piece from the Shenandoah area. Right. And before it's 100%.
Yeah, it's
That's
overfull.
ridiculous. Yeah. Like this area comes, and they're closer
very
to
close.
Weber, right? Yeah, they even can sometimes connect.
One of the last things
I heard about this.
So I was wondering if you could kind of expand on what you were talking about before. My husband and I moved to Kansas City. Our son goes to Lincoln. He's in kindergarten this year, so this is all brand new to us.
Lucky you.
Yeah. So he's at Lincoln, he's staying at Lincoln, so that's he's not being moved out. I was just curious, and it sounds like you were saying that Lincoln's been aware that maybe this was going to be happening. So teachers have been. Is that okay? I mean, that's.
They are
How that would affect. I mean, I know we'd like the small class sizes, but I don't like the small class sizes, right? And so they're going to be bigger, but it sounds like maybe that's less than
because if you look at from the standpoint of the number of kids that the number of kids that will be
I've been seeing lots of different numbers floating around, so that's where I was confused. Okay. I saw 150 or something at one point, so.
That's because what happened is in the last round, they kept this part of Lincoln and this part of Lincoln.
Yeah, that's what my husband was here for. Right. I wondered that too. And we just are renovating it.
So that's when they started to say, and then this is, there's a lot of we've got some kids here. This is so they are travel together. So that's how we got the discount.
I mean, honestly, I'm just happy because we live very close to the school, and so I'm just happy that it's such closing. Because, you know, when we moved in, everyone said that's always been on. Everyone said that's always been on. You know. Exactly. Yeah, we were all pleased to see that, but yeah, it's great. It's great. Me too.
We told them to go. The architect
well, it's perfect too, because it was otherwise it's going to be wasted space. We were there to see the goats that they put up there that were like, yeah. But I did have a question. You know, I'm following a Facebook page. I think it's what it's giving is maybe just a transcript of the meeting, and I'm not sure. So I'm reading it kind of out of context and not understanding. So when you're saying going forward that it's going to be full capacity at Lincoln, you know, if all this happens, and then you're going to move some non-necessary programs out. What are those non-necessary programs?
under this new attendance. So one of the things we look at is for some schools, not Lincoln, some schools you get low incentives.
That's not as important item, but you know, everyone has things that goes on. But okay, all right. Okay, that's mostly what I want to know about. Because I was like,
and this is the sheet of whatever else.
Yeah.
This is what the demographics look like there. So, you know, there's a number of things that are there's
excited for Lincoln to be done, so that'll be exciting. But thank you.
Bank. 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 Bank.